Thank you for joining me, ladies and gentlemen. It's William Holland again here live in New York, Counter-Strike North America. Here joining me is Chris Kolenda, President and CEO of Kolenda Strategic Leadership. He's a former senior advisor to 3 commanders of international forces in Afghanistan. He worked under 2 undersecretaries of defense for policy. He has commanded paratroopers in the volatile provinces in Afghanistan of Kundar and Nuristan regions. He has 2 books out, The Warrior's Art and The Counterinsurgency Challenge. Currently, he resides as a senior military fellow at King's College, London, England. I do thank you for your time. I know it's short notice, but I do thank you, and my audience thanks you for your contribution. You've written a very interesting article in Foreign Policy magazine. It's out now. We're going to link to it. It's titled Saffron Revolution of 2018. The basic idea outlining this article is an impending collapse in Afghanistan. With a U.S. pullout, pretty much a permanent feature, the Afghans are besieged by numerous crises, and all of them are growing. Can you lay out for my audience the political and maybe some of the fiscal crisis that besieges Kabul? Thank you for joining me.
Sure, and thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Yeah, so I laid out the Saffron Revolution of 2018 as part of what I call a pre-mortem, which is you take current trends, both on the political, on the military, the diplomatic, the economic side, and you draw out those trends to a conclusion, and then you tell the story of how things went wrong. And so in this case, the conclusion is this revolution in Afghanistan in 2018, that winds up sparking a wider regional conflict. So right now in Afghanistan, you've got a number of challenges. Primarily, under the Karzai regime, the Afghan government became one of the world's most sophisticated kleptocracies. And at the same time as it's becoming a highly sophisticated kleptocracy, you've got an insurgency that has grown substantially to the point at which it is once again a threat to the Afghan government. But the biggest threat to the Afghan government is not the Taliban, at least in the near term. It's a fiscal crisis that could create a political crisis that unravels the government. So let me lay out how this could happen. Afghanistan is the highest donor-dependent country on earth. They cannot pay for themselves without external donor support. We have already committed that we are going to leave Afghanistan by the end of 2016. And as international troops go, the likelihood that international donor money is going to go with it, especially if Afghanistan cannot reform politically, cannot dismantle this kleptocracy, then the likelihood that international money goes away too in 2017 or 2018 becomes very high risk. And that's how things could really unravel. And then, another Afghan civil war would not only be a tremendous humanitarian disaster, but it could usher in something far worse than the Taliban. And if you want to give Al-Qaeda the ability to resurrect in a place like Afghanistan, a new civil war is the most likely way that something like that might happen.
You teach strategy at King's College in England. I got to tell you and I'm sure you are aware of it. The only thing that consistently beats strategy is culture. Now, what is the value of a pre-mortem? That's what you called it, which is actually what the article in Foreign Policy magazine titled Saffron Revolution 2018. You've outlined a pre-mortem. It's a decent template. What's the value of that template? Clearly, I see it valuable not just because it fits our news cycle. It's short and neat, and it does give policy people in Washington a sense of a brief synopsis. But there's other values to it. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, exactly. So the primary value of it is you take current trend lines, and in this case, I'll use the political gridlock in Afghanistan, the growing unemployment, the reduction in international troops and forces, the fact that Afghanistan lives in a tough neighborhood, and a new great game, and you just play those trend lines out a couple of years, and you imagine what that might look like in the future, and then you ask yourself, well, what are some ways what are some policies and strategy measures, that could prevent this outcome. And then ideally you do a number of these pre-mortems, and then you look for consistent issues, in which, policy interventions, could prevent the worst outcome. So that's what the most important part of that is.
Dr. Jean Kirkpatrick, who worked under Ronald Reagan, used to scream at her aides, look, if you can't fit this on a postcard, okay, don't give it to me. In other words, policy is tough. You got to get it right, or as right as you can. People who are engaged in the implementation of policy don't have time for volumes. So your pre-mortem is a very good template. Your article outlined several policy options that the U.S. really needs to pursue actively in order to prevail, given these circumstances. You're talking about promoting reforms, assuring diplomatic neutrality, clarifying support, a peace process, and some kind of an indigenous economic baseline for Afghanistan. Let's go with the first one. You're talking about the Afghan government has to pursue a certain kind of political reform. In your article, is there a specific policy on the political side?
Well, the most important part is dismantling the kleptocracy,
right,
and creating the basis for good governance. Now, that's not going to happen overnight. It's going to happen. It's going to have to happen gradually. But the Afghan government's got to make progress in
right,
doing that. And you've got all sorts of vested interests within the government, and within the parliament and other super empowered individuals who are going to resist reforms. And so one of the biggest things that the U.S. can do is, first of all, work together with the Afghan government to lay out what those reforms need to be, and second, to help apply the appropriate leverage so the Afghan government can deal with this gridlock and resistance and actually move forward on the right political measures.
That fits into the second part, which is that because it shares a border with Iran and Pakistan, it is a tough neighborhood. An enforced diplomatic neutrality would require some kind of hegemony. Islamabad thinks of it as its backyard. In order to have some kind of diplomatic neutrality, America's going to have a footprint there. Go ahead.
Yeah, that may very well be right. This idea of diplomatic neutrality is kind of a very 19th century. But in this case, it's appropriate. Afghanistan lives in a really tough neighborhood. Pakistan, Iran, Central Asian states, China, all border.
Right.
Afghanistan, India, Russia, all near neighbors. And Afghanistan has been the subject to a great game of by different powers throughout its history. So one of the ways to take the air out of that is for Afghanistan to declare itself as diplomatically neutral, and the international community to support that neutrality and help enforce it through an enduring presence of international forces. Maybe along the lines of 10,000 that we've got right now. Right. To help preserve that, and then it also helps number 3, which is actually moving forward in a peace process in Afghanistan.
Fred Kagan at the American Enterprise Institute has laid out in several articles that there's a difference between coin and counterterrorism. In his view, if you're going to have some kind of support, Afghanistan needs 10,000 U.S. troops, or at least the ANSF, which is an international. It's almost like NATO. If anything under 10,000, you can't pull it off. So I think you're accurate there. Your article reverted to a policy option regarding a peace process. Who are the main actors here?
Well, you got to look at this in several layers. The sort of main actor at the national level would be the Afghan government and the Afghan Taliban. And of course, each of them have different constituencies. But there's also an international dimension to this. Afghanistan and its regional neighbors, and then there are localized dimensions to this, because so much of this conflict is driven by local factors. So you actually have to have a peace process that deals with at least those 3 components. And ultimately, what needs to happen is Afghanistan needs to get on a trajectory in which it goes from a state that's right now they've been at war for 36 years.
Right.
They get on a trajectory toward a peaceful outcome, and it's going to require negotiations. It's going to require a peace process that's probably going to take a decade or longer, and that peace process should not be confused with a peace deal.
Right.
Peace deals in low trust environments have a very low shelf life.
Right.
A peace process that builds trust over time is what Afghanistan's really going to need.
The vast majority of your policy options, which are fantastic, the fifth one is foster greater economic self-reliance. The professional literature on successful coin operation throughout Afghanistan was to get these people off poppy. It's a very, very tough geopolitical environment because there's no economic baseline. In your thinking, other than farming or subsistence farming, which actually may not happen, is there an economic baseline that is indigenous to Afghanistan other than poppy growth? Because if we can't attack that, you're left with a drug trade throughout the southern portion of Central Asia. I haven't seen one, but there may be one. Is there an economic baseline other than trade?
Well, yeah, there absolutely is. And the first requirement, of course, is good governance, because without good governance, you're not going to get a credible economic policy. Afghanistan does have a huge reserve of precious minerals.
That's right.
Some estimates range in $1 trillion and above. Now, the problem is that it's very inaccessible. And Afghanistan does not yet have the infrastructure to be able to exploit that. So, of course, poppy, which you mentioned, is much easier to produce. There are vested interests on all sides of this conflict that, are wanting to advance, the growth of opium. And so that's going to be a big challenge. But I see that as a challenge that's going to have to take place, after the political reform issues, after the peace process issues, after the economic issues, then I think we can deal with that and you can actually get some results.
Finally, all 5 of these policies are going to require a functioning State Department. In my view, and only in my view, we have not had a functioning instrument of diplomacy for decades. I think it's the Achilles heel of American war. Is there some way for these 5 policies, which you outlined in your article, can they coexist with today's contemporary State Department ethos? They probably can, but I guess my question is, do we need to take a look at the State Department today?
Well, I think we need to look at the national security structure writ large, because really what we're doing in a lot of these wars is fighting wars by bureaucracy, and each individual bureaucracy does its own thing, and the outcomes are always less than the sum of their parts. So we have got a problem in which our national security structures were built to manage the Cold War and to fight World War III. They were not built to fight these smaller, localized, limited wars. And so the result is that you've got wars in which nobody is really in charge. The military is in charge of a part of it, and states in charge of part of it, and USAID is in charge of part of it, but nobody's managing the trade-offs. Nobody's bringing this together.
Right.
And it's kind of like having the all-star basketball team in which each individual leads the league in certain statistics, but the team keeps losing games.
Yeah, we've seen it.
Opponents because they don't work together as a team.
Right. I want to thank you for your time. This is a great article. We are going to link to it here at Counterstrike. Foreign Policy Magazine, The Saffron Revolution in 2018. Chris Kolenda, the president and CEO of Kolenda Strategic Leadership. I do thank you for your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.